7 days after moving into the house, I received a call from the former owner. His voice sounded nervous. "I forgot to disconnect the living room camera, and I saw something you shouldn't ignore. Come alone." When the footage started playing, my entire world collapsed. The betrayal on that screen forced me to make a decision. Within the next 72 hours, I would build the most precise trap of my life. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. If you enjoy stories like this, please like the video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. A quick reminder before we move forward. This story includes fictionalized elements designed to enhance the storytelling experience. Any similarities to real individuals or situations are purely accidental. But the message about trust, betrayal, and self-protection carries real meaning. Now, let's continue.
The sharp, metallic squeal of a rusted hinge echoed through my workshop, the sound scraping against the quiet like a blade against glass. I was leaning over the old wooden doorframe, tightening the final screw, when the vibration in my pocket suddenly shattered the calm. The workshop had been peaceful moments earlier. Sunlight from the early September afternoon filtered through the dusty window panes, casting thin golden lines across the workbench, while tiny dust particles drifted lazily through the air. My name is Callum Rowland, a 61-year-old retired civil engineer, and that afternoon I was doing something simple, replacing the rusted hinge on the workshop door behind my house in Beaverton. The scent of WD-40 mixed with aged cedar filled the room, a smell I had grown to associate with the quiet rhythm of the life I rebuilt after my wife Patricia passed away 3 years earlier. The workshop had become my sanctuary. When everything else felt uncertain, fixing things with my hands gave the world structure again. I wiped a bead of sweat from my brow and leaned closer to the hinge. Just one more turn of the screwdriver and the alignment would be perfect. Patricia used to complain about squeaky doors more than anything else in the house. She said the sound made the entire place feel neglected. I suppose that was the real reason I had decided to fix the hinge that afternoon. Even now, after all these years, part of me still tried to keep the house the way she liked it. The vibration in my pocket came again stronger this time. I slipped the screwdriver into my tool belt and reached into my denim pocket. My phone screen showed an unfamiliar number. In a quiet town like Beaverton, you usually answer unknown calls without thinking much about it. Most of the time, it is a neighbor asking for help with something, or the hardware store confirming an order. I answered and lifted the phone to my ear, still tasting the bitter residue of stale coffee lingering in the back of my mouth. "Callum, is that you?" The voice was hoarse and strained, completely out of place in the slow, sleepy calm of a Tuesday afternoon. It took me a moment to recognize it. Warren Phillips. My 72-year-old neighbor lived 3 houses down the street. A retired postal worker, Warren usually spoke with the steady patience of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. But today, his voice sounded different, tight, breathless, almost frightened. "I'm calling from my house," he said quickly. 3 houses down. I frowned, glancing around the workshop as if expecting to see something out of place. "All right," I replied slowly. "What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Then Warren exhaled sharply. "I made a mistake with the security system we installed in the spring," he said. "I forgot to disconnect the cloud account from my tablet." My stomach tightened. That system had been his idea when I traveled to Seattle for a consulting job earlier in the year. He had helped me install the cameras throughout the house so I could check in remotely while I was away. "I saw something on the living room feed while you were out." Warren continued, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. Then the realization hit me. My neighbor had been able to see inside my house the entire time. I opened my mouth to ask why he had been watching, but the urgency in his voice cut me off before the question could leave my lips. "It involves your daughter, and Alistair." The words struck like a punch to the chest. Ilara and her husband had been at my house for dinner just 2 nights earlier. Nothing had seemed unusual. They laughed Emma-colored at the kitchen table, and Alistair talked about work the way he always did. Everything had appeared normal. Too normal. "What exactly did you see?" I asked, but Warren refused to explain over the phone. "It's not something I should say like this," he said quickly. "You need to come over here and see it yourself." Then his tone hardened. "And Callum, come alone." The next thing he said sent a cold chill through my spine. "Don't call Alara. Don't text her. Not until you watch the footage." My grip tightened around the phone. Alara had been the center of my world since Patricia died. She was the one person who had kept the house from feeling empty. Hearing Warren speak about her in that tense, careful voice made my stomach twist. "What did you see, Warren?" I demanded. But the line had already gone dead. I stood there in the silent workshop, the faint scent of cedar lingering in the air, staring at the dark screen of my phone. For the first time in years, the place that had always felt like my refuge suddenly felt unfamiliar. And somewhere deep in my chest, a slow, creeping dread began to grow. The engine of my truck roared to life with a harsh, violent growl that seemed to echo the sudden pounding in my chest. The sound cut through the quiet afternoon like a warning siren. I didn't bother putting away my tools or locking the workshop behind me. The urgency in Warren's voice had shattered the calm routine of my day so completely that the neat order of the woodshop no longer mattered. I slammed the truck into reverse and backed out of the driveway faster than I had in years, the tires chirping sharply against the asphalt as I turned the wheel toward the quieter edge of Beaverton. My mind refused to settle. Questions spiraled through my head faster than I could process them. Why had Warren waited until now to tell me he was still connected to my security system? More importantly, what could Alara and Alistair possibly be doing inside my house that would make a 72-year-old man sound as shaken as he had on the phone? Warren was not the kind of man who panicked easily. If he sounded frightened, there had to be a reason. I drove 3 streets over in less than 2 minutes, the familiar neighborhood blurring past my windshield. Warren's modest ranch-style house sat at the corner lot, exactly where it always had, though something about it looked more tired than usual. The faded blue siding had begun to peel in places, and the hedges that once framed the front yard had grown wild and uneven. It looked like the home of a man who had slowly stopped caring about appearances. I pulled into the gravel driveway, and the crunch of the stones beneath my tires sounded strangely loud in the still afternoon air, like bones snapping in the silence. I barely waited for the engine to settle before I pushed open the door and climbed out of the truck. Warren didn't even give me time to knock. The front door swung open just as I reached the porch steps. He stood there with one hand gripping the doorframe, his expression so strained that for a moment I barely recognized him. Deep lines carved into his face, and his eyes carried the exhausted look of someone who hadn't slept in days. He seemed older than he had only a week earlier, his shoulders sagging under a weight that wasn't visible, but was clearly there. At that moment, I understood something important. Warren Phillips wasn't just a curious neighbor who had stumbled onto something strange. The look in his eyes was the kind that comes from experience, the haunted awareness of someone who had already lived through betrayal once before. Without a word, he stepped aside and motioned for me to come in. The interior of his house was dim and quiet. He led me down a short hallway into a cramped den that smelled faintly of stale tobacco and old paper. The curtains were partially drawn, allowing only thin strips of gray afternoon light to filter through the room. The space felt heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed years of silence. Trust is a fragile thing. Like a sheet of glass, once it shatters, you can spend years trying to piece it back together, but the cracks never truly disappear. Warren gestured toward a chair across from his desk. "Sit," he said softly. But I remained standing. Every muscle in my body felt tight, coiled like a spring ready to snap. I didn't want comfort. I wanted answers. Warren took a slow breath before speaking again, his voice barely louder than a whisper. 15 years ago, he began staring down at the floor. My own son drained my entire life savings. The words hung in the air between us. He explained that it had started with something small, a lie about needing help with a mortgage payment. Warren had trusted him without question. Over time, the requests became more complicated, the explanations more urgent. By the time Warren finally reviewed the accounts carefully, it was already too late. The money was gone. I never thought he was capable of it either, Callum Warren said quietly. His hand trembled as he reached for a glass of water sitting on the desk beside him. By the time I realized what was happening, he continued, the ink was already dry. He took a slow sip before setting the glass down, and everything I worked for was gone. If you're wondering why I didn't simply turn around and walk out of that room, it's because there are moments in life when you realize that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a comfortable lie. Warren turned toward the cluttered desk beside him and pointed to the laptop sitting there. Its screen glowed with a cold blue light that seemed almost clinical against the dimness of the room. He reminded me of the weekend in the spring when he had helped me install the security cameras before my trip to Seattle. At the time, we had connected the system to both our devices so he could keep an eye on the house while I was away. But he had made one critical mistake. He had never removed his login credentials from the cloud system. I didn't watch much, Warren said quietly. It felt wrong, like I was invading your privacy. He paused, but the few minutes I did see were enough. His eyes lifted to meet mine. And Callum. It wasn't just one conversation. He explained that over the past few weeks, there had been 5 separate meetings recorded inside my living room while I was away at work. 5 different times when Alara and Alistair had come to the house and spoken about something Warren clearly believed I needed to see for myself. The silence in the room pressed down on me like physical weight. Warren's hand moved slowly toward the laptop. For a brief moment, his finger hovered over the mouse. Then he clicked. The screen flickered once, and suddenly I was staring directly into the center of my own living room. The timestamp glowing in the corner of the screen read, Monday, 2:15 p.m. The grainy footage slowly sharpened until my living room came into view, every familiar detail exactly where it should be. The old coffee table, the worn leather armchair, the framed photograph of Patricia on the shelf. It should have felt comforting. Instead, the people sitting on my sofa looked like strangers who had broken into my life. My daughter, Alara Hallbrook, 34 years old, sat forward on the edge of the couch. Her hands nervously twisted the sleeves of the blue cardigan I had given her for Christmas 2 years earlier. Beside her lounged Alistair Hallbrook, my 37-year-old son-in-law. Alistair worked as a logistics coordinator and liked to remind everyone that numbers were his specialty. On the screen, however, he looked far too relaxed in my house, leaning back with a smirk that suggested he felt completely at home. They weren't visiting. They were searching. Spread across the coffee table was a blue folder I recognized instantly. It had been sitting on my desk that morning before I left for work. My chest tightened as Alistair opened the folder and slid a document out onto the table. He picked up a pen and with a mocking grin traced my signature in the air like he was rehearsing a performance. He didn't even blink when he signed the originals, Alistair said through the laptop speakers, his voice slightly distorted by the recording. It's not stealing if it's going to be ours eventually, right? The words struck harder than any physical blow. What I was watching wasn't a sudden mistake or an impulsive decision. It was a carefully rehearsed plan. Alistair leaned forward and began explaining everything with calm, precise confidence. He described how he had convinced me to sign what I believed were routine health directive forms. In reality, the packet had been altered. Hidden among the legitimate paperwork were 2 additional pages, documents, that granted them full authority over my retirement account and the deed to the house. The room seemed to tilt. I had trusted them with decisions about my health, about what would happen if something ever went wrong. and they had used that trust like a weapon. On the screen, Ilara hesitated. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the hallway, as if she expected me to walk through the front door at any second. Alistair noticed. He leaned closer to her, his voice lowering into a calm, persuasive tone. "Your father barely checks his accounts," he said quietly. "And he trusts you. That's the real weakness here." He tapped the document. "Once the transfer goes through, it's clean. House 401k, everything. Have you ever watched someone you love examine your entire life, as if it were nothing more than a vault they had finally learned to open? The cold realization drained the warmth from the room. The daughter I had raised the child. Patricia and I had sacrificed everything for now, sat beside a man who treated my entire career, 3 decades of engineering, every hour of work, as if it were nothing more than a winning lottery ticket. Warren suddenly paused the video. The screen froze on Alistair's smirk. When I looked at Warren, his expression carried a deep, quiet pity that made something inside my chest tighten painfully. "There are 5 more recordings," he said softly. He began transferring the files to my phone. Buzz. Then again. Buzz. Each notification vibrating in my pocket felt like another nail being driven into a coffin. I stood slowly, my movements stiff and mechanical, as if my body was simply following instructions while my mind struggled to catch up. "I'll send the rest to your phone," Warren added, his voice unsteady. "You need to see everything." I nodded once. "Thank you, Warren," I said quietly. "I've seen enough for now." Outside, the cool September air wrapped around me as I stepped into the silent street. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, yet everything felt different, like a carefully designed trap meant to keep me calm, while my life was quietly dismantled behind my back. As I reached my truck, my phone lit up again. The first file had finished downloading. File _02_Wednesday_planning.mp4. The fluorescent lights inside the Canyon Road diner flickered overhead, like a failing heartbeat casting pale, uneven shadows across the vinyl booth, where I sat with a laptop in front of me and a cup of coffee slowly cooling beside my hand. I hadn't gone home. I couldn't. The thought of stepping back into that house, my house, felt impossible now. Every room that once gave me peace suddenly felt contaminated, as if the walls themselves had witnessed the quiet betrayal unfolding inside them. So instead, I drove here. The diner sat just off the main drag, one of those tired 24-hour places where truckers and night shift workers passed through without asking questions. I slid into a corner booth, needing the anonymity more than the food. The steady hum of the industrial refrigerator behind the counter and the clatter of dishes in the kitchen created a background noise that helped keep my thoughts from collapsing in on themselves. "Just coffee. Black." "Leave the pot," I told the waitress when she approached. I never even looked up from the table. What I needed wasn't caffeine. What I needed was a place where I could sit quietly long enough to process what I had just seen. The smell of burnt grease and industrial cleaner filled the air, oddly comforting, compared to the metallic taste of dread that had followed me ever since I walked out of Warren's house. My laptop sat open in front of me, its screen casting a cold glow across the table. My fingers felt heavy as I reached for the keyboard. Inside the transfer folder was the next recording, Wednesday_planning.mp4. I clicked it. The betrayal I had just witnessed wasn't simply about money, though the money alone was enough to destroy a man. It was something deeper, more methodical. Alistair hadn't just planned to steal my savings. He had carefully constructed a way to redirect my entire digital identity without me ever noticing. The video opened with the familiar view of my dining room. Ilara and Alistair were sitting at the table. Alistair had a legal pad in front of him and was tapping the pen against the paper with calm, deliberate precision. His tone carried the quiet confidence of someone explaining a business strategy. "He won't track the changes if the notifications come through me," Alistair said. Even through my headphones, I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. He explained to Alara that he had already created a separate email account, one that she controlled, which would intercept any digital alerts sent from the county clerk's office. If a property update was filed, the notification would never reach me. It would go to them instead. Have you ever sat in a crowded room and suddenly realized that everyone around you is living an ordinary evening while your own life is collapsing piece by piece? 2 booths down, a truck driver calmly sliced into a thick steak, dipping each piece into a pool of brown gravy, as if nothing in the world required his attention beyond the next bite. Meanwhile, on my laptop screen, Alistair was mocking the quiet routines that had defined my life. He spends half his time in that workshop, Alistair said, chuckling softly. He won't even notice when the deed changes. Ilara looked uneasy. Her shoulders were tense, and her eyes flicked repeatedly toward the hallway, like someone expecting trouble to walk through the door. But Alistair's certainty was persuasive. The confidence in his voice seemed to infect her hesitation like a slow-spreading parasite. The video continued. Then Alistair reached across the table and pulled a paper calendar closer. He circled a date with a red pen. September 30th. The bright ring of ink looked like a warning flare on the screen. We need to file the transfer by the morning of the 30th, Alistair said firmly. If it isn't recorded by then, the deal falls apart. I found myself unconsciously sliding a paper napkin across the diner table the same way he had pushed the calendar toward Alara. My hand trembled as I did it. Alistair continued speaking, promising her that the property would be in her name before I ever noticed a change in the tax assessment. This wasn't a vague plan. It was a schedule, a deadline. And suddenly, the numbers became painfully clear. 20 days. That was all the time left before my house, the home Patricia and I had built together, would legally disappear from under my feet. I leaned back in the booth, my stomach tightening. The diner suddenly felt colder. Without hesitating, I opened the third file. As the video began to play, Alistair's voice returned through my headphones, but this time it carried a darker edge. They gave us until the 30th, Alara, he said quietly. If we don't have the cash by then, they won't just take the house. The audio in the third file was rough and uneven, distorted by wind rushing through the cracked patio door of my own living room. I sat in the Canyon Road diner, staring at the laptop screen, the flickering neon open sign behind the window casting a ghostly reflection across the footage. The buzzing light pulsed steadily, turning the video into something that looked almost unreal. On the recording, the sliding glass door rattled loudly as it was pushed open. The microphone struggled to capture the sounds clearly, but one thing cut through the static with chilling clarity: Alistair's voice. Low, sharp, predatory. He paced across my living room, with his smartphone pressed tightly against his ear, running a hand through his hair in agitation. His voice rose and fell as he argued with someone on the other end of the line. The conversation circled around a number that echoed through the speakers like a hammer striking metal. $180,000. At first I thought he might be speaking with a bank or some kind of lender. But the longer I listened, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a legitimate financial institution. The slang Alistair used, the thinly veiled threats in his tone, and the language coming from the person on the other end made it unmistakably clear. This was something else, an underground gambling ring. Alistair hadn't fallen into debt through a failed investment or a business mistake. The money had disappeared into something reckless and compulsive. The recording captured him, promising the unseen caller that the debt would be resolved soon. His voice dropped into a strained whisper as he explained that a full liquidation of assets would be completed before the end of the month. By September 30th, everything would be settled. Hearing those words made my stomach tighten. In Alistair's world, my house wasn't a home. It was simply collateral, a payment waiting to be collected after his latest losing gamble. A few minutes later, Ilara appeared in the frame. She stepped into the living room slowly, her eyes red and swollen from crying. I had never seen my daughter look so small, as though the weight of the situation had physically shrunk her. For a brief moment, I felt something close to pity, but Alistair turned toward her immediately. The moment he saw her, the tension in his body sharpened. His movements became aggressive, his posture invasive as he closed the distance between them. He began explaining coldly and without hesitation that the people he owed were not patient men. Then he said something that made the blood drain from my face as I sat in that diner booth. If the transfer doesn't clear by the morning of the 30th. Alistair said, his voice flat, they're going to visit the school. He paused just long enough for the threat to settle. Then he said her name. Emma, my 5-year-old granddaughter. He described the school schedule, mentioning that children were outside during recess around 10:15 in the morning. The implication was unmistakable. He was using our granddaughter's safety as leverage, crushing whatever hesitation Ilara still had left. I closed my eyes for a moment. All I could see was Emma's bright smile as we planted roses together in the backyard the previous spring. Her tiny hands covered in soil, her laughter echoing across the garden as she insisted on watering the flowers herself. That memory felt impossibly clean compared to the ugliness on the screen. The thought of someone using her innocence as part of a negotiation made my stomach twist. A cold sweat formed across my palms as I gripped the edge of the diner table. Somewhere behind me, a waitress dropped a spoon onto the tiled floor. The metallic clatter rang through the room like a gunshot inside my skull. Alistair was gambling with his own child's safety to cover a $180,000 debt. I paused the video. My hands were shaking so badly, I nearly knocked over the untouched coffee sitting beside the laptop. The bitterness in my throat tasted almost metallic, like copper. In that moment, something inside me shifted. Alistair wasn't just a thief. He wasn't simply a liar manipulating paperwork. He was a man willing to sacrifice his own daughter to save himself. The part of my brain that had spent 40 years calculating structural integrity and stress tolerances finally kicked in. I had spent my life studying how buildings collapse, how small fractures grow until an entire structure fails. And now I could see the truth clearly. This wasn't just a financial problem. This was a complete structural failure of the family itself. A system so corrupted it could no longer be repaired. Demolition was the only solution. They weren't just stealing my house anymore. They were gambling with Emma's safety. And that was a debt I would never allow to be paid with my bloodline. I was about to close the laptop, my mind already racing through the beginnings of a counterstrike, when the screen chimed softly. The fourth file had finished downloading. Its thumbnail appeared on the screen. Alistair stood alone in my kitchen after midnight, his face illuminated by the pale glow of a single burner on the stove. He was speaking quietly to a woman whose voice I had never heard before. And suddenly I knew the night was far from over. Is this conversation helpful so far? The fourth video was shorter, just a few minutes of Alistair alone in the kitchen after midnight. The kitchen where I'd made pancakes for my granddaughter just days ago now looked like a crime scene in the harsh blue light of my laptop screen. Alistair was leaning against the counter phone pressed to his ear, his voice hushed and intimate in a way he never spoke to my daughter. The woman on the other end had a light, airy voice I didn't recognize, and as they spoke, the rot at the center of my family was finally laid bare. He wasn't just stealing to pay a debt. Alistair was building a lifeboat. He revealed that Ilara was merely a tool to unlock my wealth, a signature machine he was manipulating with practiced ease. Once the assets are liquidated and the cash is in the offshore account, he whispered into the receiver, "I'm handling the exit. Ilara's blind loyalty makes it easy." I watched him chuckle a dry, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "Pack your bags for Costa Rica," he told the stranger. "We're almost there." Disgust rose in my throat, like bile, a visceral reaction to the man who had sat at my Thanksgiving table while planning to leave my daughter in the ruins of a forgery case. How many layers of rot can one family hide before the whole house comes crashing down? I stared at the screen, my heart turning into a block of cold flint. I clicked on the fifth and final file dated last Saturday. This one was a confrontation. Ilara was visibly terrified, her hands shaking, as she tried to tell Alistair she wanted to back out of the deed transfer. She felt watched, she said. She felt the weight of the lie, but Alistair didn't offer comfort. He turned brutal. He stepped into her personal space, grabbing her upper arm with a grip that looked painful even through the grainy footage. Then he did the unthinkable. He began reciting Emma's exact school recess schedule at Hawthorne Elementary. 10:15 a.m., he hissed. You want the investors waiting by the fence at 10:15. He wasn't just warning her about the criminals. Alistair was the one who had provided the schedule to the debt collectors. He had sold out his own daughter's safety to ensure Ilara wouldn't lose her nerve. I watched my daughter's spirit visibly break on the screen as she slumped into a chair, her resistance replaced by a hollow, defeated compliance. Hawthorne Elementary, 10:15 a.m. He knew exactly where she'd be standing. The diner was nearly empty now. The only sound, the low hum of the industrial refrigerator, and the occasional tap of rain starting to hit the window pane. I closed the laptop, the silence of the booth feeling heavier than the noise of the city outside. I pulled out my yellow legal pad, the coarse paper feeling real and solid under my fingertips. I drew a single vertical line down the center, labeling the columns with the only two words that mattered now: protect and punish. I am a civil engineer. I have spent my life understanding how things hold together, and more importantly, exactly how they fail. I know how to find the structural weakness in a man, and Alistair Holbrook was nothing but a series of fractures held together by ego. I realized that to save Emma, I had to be as methodical and ruthless as the man trying to destroy us. Protect the innocent first, I whispered to the empty diner. Deal with the guilty later. I walked out to the parking lot, the cool air sharp in my lungs. I started the engine and watched the dashboard clock flip to 1:32 a.m. By sunrise, the first pillar of Alistair's plan would be ready to fall.
Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of gray Oregon mist that hides everything in plain sight. I poured my oatmeal into the same ceramic bowl Patricia had bought on our 20th anniversary. My hands so steady it felt like I was back at the firm, drafting blueprints for a bridge that was never meant to collapse. I follow my 6:15 a.m. routine with surgical precision, showering, making coffee, and stepping onto the porch to feed the neighbor's cat. Every movement is a calculated mask, to hide the fact that I spent the night cataloging my daughter's betrayal in a diner booth. The smell of cedar and morning rain drifts through the open window, a sharp, stinging clarity of light that makes the west slope look normal, but feel entirely hollow. Routine is a shield I have worn for years, but today it feels like armor. Patricia would have known something was wrong the moment I walked into the kitchen. She always saw through my stoic engineering facade.
But she isn't here to warn me about the rot growing in our own bloodline. The morning call from Ilara wasn't just routine. As the phone chirped on the counter, I realized she was using the exact distraction tactics I'd heard her and Alistair discuss in the video. She wasn't just a passive bystander. She was an active, conscious participant in the timing of this theft. At exactly 10 a.m., the digital chirp of my smartphone broke the silence. I picked it up, watching the name Ilara flash on the screen. "Hi, Dad. Just checking in." Her voice came through light and carefully pitched to sound like a concerned daughter. "How are you feeling today?" I responded with the exact amount of warmth she expected. My voice steady even as my mind replayed the footage of her twisting her cardigan while Alistair mapped out my ruin. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I told her. "Just working in the garden." "How is Emma?" Every word felt like a structural test. I realized that every inquiry into my health was actually a probe to see if her financial trap had been tripped yet. How do you band-aid a heart that's being shredded by the person you die to protect? I stood there clutching the cool, smooth ceramic of my bowl. listening to the rhythmic tap of the coffee maker, as my daughter lied to me with the same ease she used to tell me she'd finished her homework 25 years ago. Her voice was like a well-polished mirror, bright and clear, but only reflecting what I was supposed to see, hiding the dark silver backing where the lies were etched. Ilara mentioned they would stop by tomorrow afternoon. Alistair wants to help you with that fence, she added. I agreed readily, maintaining the docile senior persona they've assigned to me. I'd like that, I said. I'll make sure to have some tea ready. But I knew better. Alistair's offer to fix the fence was a ruse to get me out of the house, a way to ensure I was occupied in the yard, while they searched my office for my original non-forged identity documents. They needed the real papers to make the fake ones stick. As soon as the line went dead, the warmth left my face like a sunset behind a storm wall. The facade was for them, but the action was for me. I grabbed my keys, the metal cold against my palm. I pulled out of the driveway, but I wasn't heading to the hardware store for fence supplies. I was heading to a place where I could find a very different kind of specialist. The sliding glass doors of the Beaverton Library hissed shut behind me, sealing out the damp Oregon morning and leaving me in a silence that felt heavy with the secrets I was about to dig up. I walked past the front desk, with a stiff nod, seeking out a back corner computer terminal, where the stacks would shield me from any inquisitive eyes. My own laptop was back in the workshop, but I needed a neutral digital trail today. I sat down and began searching for specialists in power of attorney fraud and elder abuse, my engineer's mind, filtering through names and reviews like I was auditing a structural schematic. One name consistently surfaced with high praise: Evelyn Chambers. Her profile described a woman who didn't just know the law, but knew how to weaponize it against those who prey on the vulnerable. My hands stilled on the keyboard when I realized Chambers was the same lead counsel who handled the high-profile case Warren Phillips had mentioned last week. She had a personal history with exactly the kind of toxic greed Alistair was exhibiting. I didn't need someone to just defend my assets. I needed someone who knew how to dismantle a predator. I stepped into the library lobby and dialed the number for Chambers' office. The receptionist was professional, but I could hear the sharp, jagged edge of urgency in my own voice as I mentioned words like power of attorney revocation and fraudulent filings. I felt a small surge of momentum when she scheduled me for a consultation on Friday morning at 9:30 a.m. I spent the rest of the afternoon at a nearby print shop, the air thick with the smell of toner and warm paper, as I meticulously scanned the files Warren had given me. I organized them into a heavy physical folder, creating a legal arsenal that felt as solid as a foundation stone in my hands. Have you ever looked at your own front door and realized it was no longer an entrance, but a barricade you were about to breach? I drove home with that heavy folder tucked deep under my passenger seat, the taste of copper in the back of my throat as the adrenaline began to spike. There they were, the predators on the porch. As I turned onto my street, my heart hammered against my ribs at the sight of Ilara's silver sedan parked in my driveway with Alistair's black truck idling behind it. They weren't supposed to be here until tomorrow afternoon. My 5-year-old granddaughter Emma was a bright spark of blonde hair and boundless energy sitting on the porch swing with a coloring book that she abandoned the moment she saw my truck. I forced a smile for her, a mask that felt like it might crack my face open. Alistair stepped off the porch, flanked by a man in a gray jumpsuit carrying a heavy tool bag. A handyman, Alistair called him, but I recognized the distinctive set of picks hanging from his belt. He was a locksmith. Alistair wasn't here for a social visit. He had brought a specialist of his own to help him bypass the safe in my basement, where I kept the original property deed. I gripped the legal folder tightly, sliding it deep into the dark crevice between the seats as Alistair approached the driver's side window, his eyes searching my face for any sign that the old man had finally figured out the game. The walk from the driveway to the porch felt like a march toward a gallows I'd built for my own family. A grandfather's smile is supposed to be the easiest thing in the world to wear, but as I stepped onto the porch, mine felt like a mask made of lead, heavy and cold against my skin. I forced my features into a practiced softness, greeting Emma with a hug that felt like the only real thing left in this house. Stepping inside, I entered a space that no longer felt like mine. Ilara was in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up as she helped Emma with a coloring book, looking every bit the devoted daughter I had raised. Alistair stood in the hallway, his presence a jagged intrusion in the foyer. He didn't even wait for a hello before asking about the refinance folder he claimed I'd left out on the desk. I had to swallow the bitter bile rising in my throat and pretend I'd forgotten exactly where I put it. I played the part of the slightly confused senior they so desperately wanted me to be, watching Alistair's artificial, gleaming smile widen as he thought he was winning. During a brief moment over the counter, Ilara made a strange slip of the tongue, mentioning a Costa Rica travel brochure she'd seen. It was a chilling revelation. Alistair was already grooming her for the move, though she clearly didn't realize she wasn't actually part of his real exit plan. We eventually sat down to a dinner of takeout Thai food, the air thick with the smell of spicy ginger and soy that couldn't mask the unspoken lies. Alistair was overly friendly, a predator in a polo shirt talking about future-proofing my estate, while Ilara kept her eyes fixed on her plate. Her guilt was nearly visible in the way her hands trembled as she held her fork. I watched Emma eat her innocence, the only thing keeping me from flipping the table and shouting the truth. Every laugh from Alistair felt like a physical blow to my chest, a reminder of the mistress and the gambling debt he was hiding behind this domestic farce. Have you ever looked at the face of your own child and seen a stranger looking back, counting the days until you're out of the way? I felt a nausea that no amount of tea could wash away. Alistair leaned in, insisting we finalize the deed update next week for my own protection. I nodded, playing the docile fool. "You're right, Alistair," I said. "Safety first. That's what I always say. Tick, tick, tick." The wall clock wasn't just measuring time. It was counting down to a collision. Long after they'd left, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house louder than the dinner conversation. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to shift, like the fraudulent clauses Alistair had inserted into my life. I realized I had 48 hours until I met Evelyn Chambers. That was 48 hours of looking my daughter in the eye and pretending I didn't know she was helping a man who intended to discard her like trash. The rough texture of the bedsheets felt like sandpaper as I twisted in the dark. I stood up to get water and noticed the workshop door slightly ajar. My heart stopped. I checked the logs later. Alistair hadn't just stopped by early. He'd gone into the workshop while I was busy at the table and took photos of my personal ledger, looking for the account numbers to bypass my remaining security. I closed my eyes, but the last thing I saw wasn't sleep. It was the red light on the workshop security panel blinking like a warning I was finally ready to heed. The morning sun had felt almost cruel that day, shining far too brightly over a house filled with secrets. By afternoon, however, the familiar gray clouds of Oregon had rolled back across the sky, draping Beaverton in a cool mist that seemed to match the heaviness in my chest. In the backyard garden, Emma's laughter cut through the quiet, like a silver bell, bright and innocent. The sound was so pure, it made the weight of the lies sitting in my pocket feel unbearable. We stood among the rows of tomato plants Patricia had planted years before she became ill. The garden had always been her sanctuary, and somehow it had become mine after she was gone. Watching Emma move carefully between the vines felt like watching Patricia's memory come to life again. My 5-year-old granddaughter hopped from one patch of soil to the next, careful not to step on the stems, as she inspected each growing fruit with serious concentration. I knelt down in the dirt beside the plants, letting the damp earth stain my jeans and work its way beneath my fingernails. The simple grounding feeling of soil in my hands was the only thing keeping me steady in that moment. "Look, Grandpa, the tomatoes are getting bigger," Emma called excitedly. Her voice carried the kind of wonder adults often forget exists. "They sure are." I replied, wiping a cool spray of water from the garden hose off my cheek. Just like you. Emma leaned closer to one of the vines, studying the bright green tomatoes, as if they were treasures slowly forming before her eyes. As we moved through the rows together, she suddenly leaned toward me, lowering her voice the way children do when they believe they are sharing an important secret. "Daddy said I'm going on a long airplane trip soon," she whispered. My heart stopped. The words confirmed the fear that had been forming quietly in the back of my mind. Alistair wasn't just planning a financial escape. He was preparing to take Emma with him. The image of a suitcase packed with a child's life flashed across my thoughts, and the idea that Alara might not even be part of that plan made my stomach twist. Innocence is fragile, like the first thin frost on a greenhouse window. One warm breath of truth can make it disappear forever. Emma reached out and gently touched one of the ripening tomatoes. "Grandpa," she asked softly, "when I grow up, will you teach me how to build things?" The question struck deeper than she could possibly understand. Years ago, I had made the same promise to a young Alara. Somewhere between then and now, that promise had been broken. "I'll teach you everything I know, sweetheart," I said quietly. My voice felt thick with emotion. As I spoke, I looked up and noticed Alara standing on the patio. She watched us silently, her expression unreadable from where I knelt in the soil. In that moment, I understood something important. I wasn't just fighting for a house or a bank account anymore. I was fighting for the version of Alara that Emma still believed in. Part of me wanted to stand up and warn her to tell my daughter that the man she trusted was quietly tracking her every move. But I couldn't break the illusion yet. The mask had to stay in place. So I remained in the dirt, caught between the loving grandfather Emma believed me to be and the quiet strategist I was becoming in order to protect her. The spell of the garden broke when Alara finally called out, "Come on, Emma, we need to get home." Her voice carried an edge that made my skin prickle. Emma waved enthusiastically as she climbed into the back seat of the silver sedan. "Bye, Grandpa. See you tomorrow." I lifted my hand in return, forcing a small smile as the car pulled away from the driveway. The red taillights faded slowly into the gray afternoon mist. Then something caught my eye. A brief flash of dull silver glinted beneath the rear bumper. I stepped closer to the edge of the driveway and squinted through the fading light. There, tucked neatly beneath the curve of the metal frame, was a small magnetic device, a GPS tracker. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Alistair wasn't just manipulating paperwork and finances. He was monitoring Alara's movements too, ensuring that no one could interfere with whatever escape he was planning. I stood there for a long moment, staring down the empty street. The image of that tracker burned into my mind. This wasn't just a thief I was dealing with. It was a jailer. The kitchen was too quiet, the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock sounding less like a timepiece and more like a judge's gavel striking the bench over and over. I stood at the counter, the smell of grilled chicken and rice filling the air. Yet I had no appetite. I had spent 40 years designing structures meant to withstand the elements, but I was currently failing to withstand the silence of my own home. The dining table felt like a vast, empty continent, with Patricia's chair at the head and Alara's childhood spot to my left, both vacant. I sat in the dim light, realizing that in the years since I lost Patricia, I'd grown used to the quiet, but tonight the silence had a jagged, heavy edge that made my skin crawl. "It's just dinner, Callum," I whispered to the empty room. "Eat," but the food tasted like ash. This house used to be so loud with laughter and the chaotic energy of a growing family, and now it was just a shell filled with echoes. While I was cleaning the table afterward, my fingers brushed against something hard under the rim of my own chair. I leaned down, peeling back a strip of adhesive. A microphone, small, black, and cold. Alistair wasn't just tracking Alara. He was listening to my private moments. How many years of trust does it take to build a life? And how many seconds of greed does it take to tear it down? I held the bug in my palm, the metallic intrusion making me feel physically ill. Alistair Holbrook was a cancer, and my daughter was merely infected. I walked to the pantry door, my thumb tracing the rough texture of the growth chart notches carved into the wood. I wondered when Alara stopped being the girl who cried over a scraped knee and became the woman who could help forge a signature. Did I fail her? Or did I just stop paying attention while I was busy being the provider? The guilt was a heavy weight, but then I remembered the way Alistair had weaponized Emma's school schedule. The self-doubt evaporated, replaced by a cold, protective fire that burned away the last of my hesitation. A microphone in my own home. The intrusion was total, but so was my response. I didn't smash the device. I simply put it back. If Alistair wanted to listen, I would give him exactly what I wanted him to hear, nothing but the sounds of an old man going to bed early. I moved to the den with mechanical precision, closing the door softly. I began to finalize the documents for tomorrow's meeting with Evelyn Chambers. I organized the bank statements, the forged power of attorney copy Warren gave me, and my own original documents into a neat, high-tensile stack. I am no longer just a father or a grandfather. I am an engineer building a fortress that no gambler or thief can breach. Everything was in its place, just like a blueprint. As I prepared the folder, I realized Alistair's biggest tactical error, the original deed he was so desperate to find, was never in this house. Years ago, as part of my own engineer's redundancy plan, I had moved it to a secure safety deposit box. Tomorrow, the doors lock. I set the folder on the nightstand and turned off the lamp, but as the darkness swallowed the room, I knew that Alistair's biggest mistake wasn't the theft, it was underestimating a man who had nothing left to lose but the truth. Task 4.3. Friday morning, September 20th arrived with a sky the color of cold steel. I pulled the heavy brass handle of the law office door at exactly 9:15 a.m., the cold September air biting at my heels, as if trying to pull me back into the comfort of my own ignorance. I was met with the faint, dignified scent of old paper and expensive coffee that seemed to cling to the dark wood of the reception desk. Within minutes, I was ushered into the inner sanctum to meet Evelyn Chambers, a 56-year-old attorney specializing in elder law, who sat behind a desk as clean and sharp as her intellect, her eyes possessing the clinical depth of a master inspector. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I simply placed the organized folder on the mahogany surface between us. As an engineer, I presented the facts as a series of load-bearing failures in my family's foundation. "I need a legal bulkhead, Miss Chambers," I said. "Something Alistair Holbrook cannot bypass." She looked at me for a long moment before opening the file. "Tell me everything, Mr. Rowland," she replied with a voice that was both firm and inviting. "Don't leave out the parts that hurt." Evelyn revealed something almost immediately. The notary who supposedly witnessed the forged power of attorney was a known associate of a local shady lender. This confirmed that Alistair had already entangled my life with a criminal network. Evelyn reviewed the documents with a clinical intensity, her finger stopping on specific clauses Alistair had inserted into the text. She explained that while the health directive was what I had intended to sign, the filed version granted broad financial authority that bordered on total guardianship. This clause here, she noted, tracing a line on the paper. It grants broad financial authority. "Did you intend that?" My jaw tightened. "No, I intended to protect my health, not lose my home." Her calm voice provided a stabilizing contrast to the quiet rage I had been fueling all week. Have you ever felt the exact moment the tide turns? It doesn't happen with a roar. It happens in the silence between heartbeats. I felt the weight of the last few days begin to shift as Evelyn outlined our counteroffensive. She was a master of the legal structure, identifying every weak point Alistair had tried to exploit. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were preparing to demolish his carefully constructed lies. Click. The sound of a door locking from the inside. His power was gone. Evelyn's assistant brought in the fresh revocation papers, and I signed them with a hand that didn't tremble, the black ink feeling like a seal on a containment vessel. The notary's stamp hit the paper with a sharp metallic click that echoed in the quiet room, a sound of absolute finality. Evelyn promised that by noon, every major bank and the county recorder would have electronic notice that the Halbrook Power was dead. "It's done," she said, leaning back. "You've officially taken back the keys to your life." I looked at the drying ink, a grim satisfaction settling over me. "Good," I replied. "Now I want to see how he tries to open the locks." As I rose to leave, Evelyn informed me that she had already flagged my social security number for potential identity theft. She discovered that Alistair had attempted to open a new credit line in my name just 48 hours prior. I walked out of that office and headed straight for the bank, checking my watch as the digital numbers flipped to 11 a.m. The countdown to Alistair's collapse had officially begun. The bank lobby was a tomb of glass and marble, and I was there to bury Alistair's access to my life savings once and for all. I stepped into the clinical, sterile-smelling air of First National Bank, with a jaw set like concrete. The bank lobby was busy, but for me everything else had faded into a blurred background of ticking clocks and shuffling papers. I was ushered into a glass-walled office to meet Andrea Bennett, a 42-year-old personal banker with a sharp bob and even sharper eyes, who had been the gatekeeper of my finances since Patricia was still alive. I didn't waste time. I presented the certified revocation papers from Evelyn's office, the heavy stock paper feeling like a weapon in my hand. "Andrea, I need these funds moved to a private account immediately," I told her, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register. I watched her scan the documents, her professional mask slipping just for a second, when she realized the scope of the fraud. "Mr. Roland given the power of attorney revocation. I've flagged this for the fraud department as well," she said. Then she leaned in, her voice hushed. "I should tell you Alistair Halbrook called this morning to inquire about daily withdrawal limits." My stomach did a slow roll. My timing had been a matter of mere hours. If I had waited until the afternoon, the $680,000 I'd spent 40 years building would have been a ghost. Do you know the difference between a fence and a fortress? A fence keeps people out. A fortress makes them regret trying to get in. I sat in silence as Andrea's pen scratched across the forms, finalizing the transfer of my liquid assets into a newly established individual account. We didn't just move the money. We implemented a total scorched earth policy on my digital footprint. We changed every password, recovery email, and security question, implementing dual-factor authentication that required my physical signature in person for any transaction over $5,000. The cool, steady hum of the air conditioning seemed to keep pace with the focused rhythm of my breathing. Once the final digital vault was sealed, I walked out to my truck, the weight off my chest, feeling like a physical lightness in my step. I sat in the parking lot and made a call to a former colleague, a retired investigator with deep FBI connections. I provided specific details about the illegal gambling operation Alistair mentioned in the recordings, framing it as an immediate threat to Emma's safety. "Monday morning, Callum," my contact promised, the voice sounding like gravel. "The wheels will start turning." Cold satisfaction settled over me. Alistair wasn't just fighting a civil battle now. He was walking into a federal trap, locked, barred, secured. The Halbrook era was over. I returned home and sat at my kitchen table with my yellow legal pad, the rough surface familiar under my palm. I created a final spreadsheet with 3 columns: assets secured, authority revoked, and exposure logged. I checked off every box with a steady hand, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my glasses as I audited my own defense. The house was quiet, but for the first time in weeks, the silence felt like a victory rather than a haunting. Every door was locked both physically and legally. As I went to close my laptop, a small notification caught my eye on the network admin panel. A new unauthorized device was logged into my home's Wi-Fi. Alistair was using a signal booster from the rental house across the street to try and hack into my server. I watched the unknown device blink on my screen, a ghost in the machine that thought it was still in control. "Go ahead, Alistair," I whispered to the empty room. "Try the door." Monday morning arrived with a notification that made my phone vibrate against the nightstand, like a warning siren signaling that the first wall of my fortress had been struck. I didn't reach for it with the panic of a victim, but with the cold, measured movements of an engineer monitoring a stress test. The sharp, rhythmic vibration was the only sound in my bedroom, aside from the low hum of the rain against the glass. I sat up, the smell of cold coffee sitting on the nightstand, from my late-night vigil stinging my nostrils. The automated alert from my bank was precise and attempted login, using my credentials from an unrecognized IP address in Southeast Beaverton. I didn't need to guess who it was. I opened my laptop, the blue sterile light washing over my face, and logged into the hidden ceiling camera feed I had established in Ilara's rental house. On the screen, I saw my daughter sitting at her small kitchen table. Her face was illuminated by the flickering glow of her own screen, her brow furrowed in deep frustration. She was trying and failing to use a backdoor password Alistair had generated weeks ago using a keylogger he'd secretly installed on my workshop computer. I watched her fingers fly across the keys, desperate to find the crack in the foundation I had already reinforced with steel. "Come on, work," I heard her whisper through the high-gain microphone. "Why is it asking for a physical token? Have you ever watched a predator realize they've stepped into a trap of their own making? The silence that follows is the loudest sound in the world." I watched her lean back, her eyes wide with a growing, frantic realization. She picked up her phone and dialed a number on speakerphone. I adjusted my volume, listening. As she identified herself to a bank representative, her voice pitched high with a forced, artificial politeness. She attempted to use the power of attorney to verify what she called a technical glitch, but the representative's voice was a wall of clinical finality. "I am sorry, ma'am." The voice crackled through the distorted speakers, but that authority was formally revoked as of noon last Friday. All accounts are currently under a restricted freeze pending a secondary fraud investigation. The blood drained from Ilara's face in high definition, a silent, hollow scream captured in the grain of the video. It was the look of a bridge collapsing in slow motion. Southeast Beaverton, 82nd Avenue. I was watching her world collapse from 30 miles away. Ilara's hands trembled so violently she almost dropped the phone as she ended the call. She didn't wait a second before redialing Alistair. I watched her pace the small living room, her eyes darting toward the window with the wide, white-rimmed stare of a cornered animal. She was clutching a legal pad, her knuckles white. When Alistair didn't pick up, she left a frantic voicemail, her voice cracking under the pressure. "Alistair, pick up. The bank, they said it is gone. Everything is blocked." He knows Alistair. I think he knows everything. But then she added something that made my blood run cold. She mentioned a third account, something about a subsidiary filing Alistair had made in my name that I hadn't found in my own audit. The fraud was deeper and more complex than even I had mapped out. I closed my laptop. The image of my daughter's total unraveling etched into my mind like a failed stress test. I watched the status bar on my screen. Alistair's car was just pulling into her driveway, and the look on his face through the dashcam hack was pure, unadulterated rage. The sound of Alistair's tires screeching on the asphalt was the first thing the audio recorder picked up, a jagged tearing of the quiet evening air. The front door of the rental didn't just open. It hit the wall with a crack that sounded like a gunshot through my laptop. Speakers followed immediately by the heavy, uneven tread of a man who had lost his grip on everything but his anger. I adjusted the grainy, high-contrast night vision feed on my screen, watching as Alistair Halbrook stormed into the living room, bringing the smell of rain and exhaust with him. He threw his keys onto the counter with enough force to rattle the dishes in the sink. Ilara was cowering near the counter, her face pale and tear-streaked. Alistair began pacing the small space like a caged predator, his voice a low, vibrating growl as he demanded to know exactly what the bank teller said. He refused to believe the old man could have been smart enough to revoke the authority on his own. "What do you mean revoked?" he roared. "I saw him sign those papers." Ilara's voice was thin, a structural failure in itself. "He's a retired engineer, Alistair. He's not stupid. He's methodical." That was when Alistair pulled out a folded document. He revealed that he had already pre-signed a quitclaim deed using the forged power of attorney, intending to bypass the bank entirely by going straight for the land title. Have you ever seen the exact moment a person realizes they've sold their soul for a debt they can never pay? It looks like Ilara's face right now. I watched as Alistair's desperation turned into physical intimidation. He grabbed Ilara by the shoulders, his white-knuckled grip shaking her, as he explained that the people he owed were done waiting. The September 30th deadline was immovable. 7 days, Ilara. We have 7 days before they stop calling and start knocking. He forced her to look at him, reminding her that she was already an accomplice, and that the police wouldn't care who started the forgery once the signatures were verified. "You signed those papers too," he hissed. "You're in this as deep as I am. You want to lose Emma to the state." The cruelty of his logic was a pressure cooker, and I could see my daughter's spirit buckling under the load. 7 days. 7 days until the wolves came for my family, and Alistair was the one holding the door open. My heart felt like it was being compressed in a vice as I watched his hands on her, my own breathing heavy and synchronized with the static on the feed. Alistair eventually calmed down into a cold, sharp focus that was far more terrifying than his yelling. He decided that the bank was a lost cause for now and pivoted the entire plan toward the property deed. "Forget the cash," he said, his eyes narrow. "If we get the deed recorded at the county office, we own the leverage." He instructed Ilara to have the paperwork ready for the morning, claiming the land title office wouldn't have the revocation update for another 48 hours. "Tomorrow morning, the county office. Be ready." I watched as he slammed out of the house, but the audio stayed live as he reached his truck. He made a muffled phone call to his mistress, revealing that he planned to cut the wait, meaning Ilara, as soon as the deed was filed. The bastard had no loyalty, even as the ship was sinking. He left Ilara collapsed in a chair, sobbing into her hands. I watched her reach for her phone, her fingers hovering over my contact name for a long, agonizing minute before she slowly put the device face down on the table and let out a sob that broke my heart all over again. Tuesday morning arrived with a stillness that felt like the intake of breath before a scream, and through the pinhole lens of the ceiling camera, I watched my son-in-law become a monster. I sat in my workshop surrounded by the scent of cedar and oil, but my mind was miles away in Ilara's rental. Alistair was pacing the small living room, like a caged predator, his movements jagged and aggressive. He was berating Ilara for her hesitation, insisting that they file the deed transfer at the county office today before I could block it. His desperation was palpable. He checked his watch every few seconds, signaling that his debt-induced clock was ticking towards zero. Ilara sat on the sofa, clutching a throw pillow to her chest, as if it were a tactical shield against the storm of his anger. "We go to the county office today." Alistair barked, his face leaning into hers. "I don't care if you're scared." Ilara's voice was a fragile whisper. "What if Dad knows Alistair? What if he is waiting for us?" Alistair let out a jagged sound that was supposed to be a laugh. "He's an old man, Ilara. He's probably just confused by the new bank app." Then Alistair dropped the mask entirely. He admitted that he had personally walked the loan sharks past Emma's school to show them the target, proving his betrayal was an active choice, not a desperate reaction. Have you ever heard the sound of a mother's soul being traded for a lie? It's a silence so deep it swallows the room. Alistair snapped, grabbing Ilara's arm with a white-knuckled grip and pulling her toward him. He dropped the cold final threat. The loan sharks knew Emma's exact recess time at Hawthorne Elementary, 10:15 a.m. He told her that if they didn't deliver the deed as collateral today, Those criminals would make an example of our 5-year-old by the playground fence. I felt a sour, sharp scent of fear, my own or hers I couldn't tell, drift through the mental image of the screen. I watched my daughter collapse into total defeat, her spirit breaking, as she realized her own husband had weaponized their child's safety. "You said you would leave her out of this," she sobbed, her body shaking under the load of his coercion. "You promised." Alistair didn't flinch. "Promises don't pay debts, Ilara. Only deeds do." He let go of her arm, leaving red marks on her skin that burned into my retinas. 9 a.m. That was the time they set for the end of my life. I decided it would be the start of theirs. Ilara nodded slowly, her face a mask of hollow grief as she agreed to meet him at the county office tomorrow morning to finalize the filing. Alistair smoothed his shirt with a chilling return to composure, as if he hadn't just threatened a child. "Good girl," he said, his voice returning to that artificial, oily warmth. "Just act like nothing is wrong when the old man calls." As he headed for the door, he instructed her to bring the notarized backup, revealing a second set of forged documents I hadn't accounted for in my initial audit. I felt a cold, mechanical click in my chest as I closed the laptop lid. The silence of my workshop now felt like a command center. They expect to meet a clerk tomorrow. They are going to meet the truth. I reached for my phone and dialed Evelyn Chambers, my voice a whisper that carried the weight of a funeral. "It's happening tomorrow, Evelyn. We need to be ready by 9. The phone call to Evelyn was brief, the kind of conversation men have when there are no words left to waste, and the only thing remaining is the cold, hard geometry of a trap. I stood in my workshop, the smell of cold iron and motor oil clinging to my flannel shirt, feeling the strategic weight of the next 24 hours. I relayed the updated timeline to Evelyn Chambers, informing her that Alistair and Ilara intended to file the forged deed at the county office tomorrow morning at 9. I explained that Alistair had doubled down weaponizing Emma's safety to force Ilara's hand. Evelyn's voice remained a pillar of professional ice over the line. She informed me that simply blocking the deed at the county level wasn't enough to stop Alistair's criminal associates. To trigger an immediate state-level asset freeze and provide the protection we needed, we required a formal in-person service of process. "We won't just block them, Callum," she said. "We will serve them in the act." She agreed to coordinate with a civil process server to meet me at Ilara's rental house instead of the courthouse. We weren't just stopping a theft. We were turning their moment of victory into a formal ambush. I sat at my workbench and opened my tablet, the smooth screen glowing with the raw data of my family's betrayal. I didn't need the images of their faces anymore. The scratchy recorded voices were enough to dismantle Alistair's house of cards. I began the methodical process of cueing specific clips, my fingers moving with the precision I used to apply to bridge schematics. I selected the recording where Alistair mocked Ilara's blind loyalty while planning to abandon her for Costa Rica. Then I cued the chilling moment where he detailed Emma's school recess schedule. "This isn't just evidence," I whispered to the empty workshop. "It's a mirror." I tested the volume levels, ensuring the audio was clear enough to pierce through any lie Alistair might try to tell. "Have you ever held the power to destroy a man's life in the palm of your hand? It's lighter than you'd expect, about the weight of a 10-inch tablet." I felt a calculated fury warming my chest, a stark contrast to the damp Oregon evening pressing against the workshop windows. Click. The playback was perfect. The betrayal was audible. I received a final text from Evelyn confirming that because I had recorded these conversations in my own home, Oregon's one-party consent laws made the evidence fully admissible in civil proceedings. My home, my rules. The truth doesn't need permission when the foundation is already under attack. I felt a strange sense of professional satisfaction. As an engineer, I appreciate a system that works exactly as it was intended. I watched the low digital hum of the charging tablet and placed it carefully inside my jacket pocket. The weight of the device felt like a holstered weapon, solid and ready. As I reviewed the audio one last time, a voice caught my ear that I hadn't fully processed before. The woman Alistair was speaking to, the mistress he intended to flee with, wasn't a stranger. Her laugh was distinctive, a sharp sound I recognized from a rival engineering firm I had consulted for years ago. This wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a layer of industrial espionage I hadn't seen coming. I plugged the charger into the wall and watched the little green lightning bolt appear on the screen. It was the only light in the workshop, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. The darkness in the workshop was absolute save for the single wedding photo still hanging near the door, a relic of a 1990 promise that felt like it was screaming in the silence. I sat on my old wooden stool, the smell of cold sawdust and motor oil anchoring me to a life Patricia and I had built, brick by brick, over 30 years. I reached out my fingers, brushing the cool, smooth glass of the frame. As I adjusted the backing, a thin piece of paper fluttered out, a letter Patricia had tucked away before the cancer took her. I read her elegant script by the dim glow of my flashlight, my heart constricting as I saw her warnings about our daughter. She had seen Ilara's blind spots long before. I had specifically her tendency to lose herself in men who mirrored the chaos she didn't know how to fix. Am I saving her, Patricia? I whispered into the rafters. Or am I just finishing what Alistair started? The agonizing weight of the morning's mission pressed down on me. I was about to destroy my daughter's current reality, yet I knew it was the only way to safeguard our granddaughter's future. Protect the innocent first, I reminded myself. Deal with the guilty later. I recalled Emma's face in the garden, the way her eyes lit up when she asked me to teach her how to build. Then, like a physical blow, I replayed Alistair's voice on the recording, reciting her school schedule like he was reading a menu for a predator. The conflict inside me crystallized into a cold, hard line in the sand. Alistair Halbrook would receive no mercy, but Ilara had to be given a door to walk through, however narrow. If you had to set your own house on fire to kill the snakes inside, would you have the courage to strike the match? I knew the answer now. Emma loses a mother if I destroy Ilara entirely, but she loses her life if I do nothing. Love in this house had always meant providing, but now it meant enforcing consequences. Being a father didn't just mean shielding your children. Sometimes it meant letting them strike the ground hard enough to finally wake up. I felt a determined moral clarity wash over me, replacing the soul-searching agony that had kept me paralyzed since the first phone call from Warren. Silence. Then the click of the latch. The decision was made. I stood up and walked to the small wall calendar where I used to track bridge project deadlines and concrete pours. I didn't see engineering dates anymore. I saw the geometry of a life-saving operation. I decided on my own protocol, separate from the legal one Ilara would have until sunset tomorrow, to choose Emma over Alistair. I turn off the workshop light, leaving only the green charging glow of the tablet to pierce the gloom. I walked toward the house, my boots crunching on the gravel with a stride that had no room for further doubt. I was ready for the morning. Choice is a structural necessity, and I was about to force hers. By offering her a path to redemption, I knew I was violating the strict total asset freeze Evelyn recommended, potentially putting my own legal standing at risk. But some things are worth the hazard. I set the alarm for 7:30 a.m. and lay in the dark, my heart beating with the slow, heavy thud of a ticking clock that was about to strike 9. Wednesday morning arrived with the clinical chill of an operating room, and as I buttoned my gray shirt, I felt less like a father and more like a surgeon about to excise a tumor. I followed my routine with robotic precision, brewing coffee, charring a single slice of toast, and feeding the neighbor's cat. These mundane acts steadied my hands, though I found myself checking my watch every 5 minutes, as if I were timing a detonation. At 8:30 a.m., I pulled out of my driveway, heading toward the Southeast 82nd Avenue rental. The commute felt like a funeral procession for the life I used to know. I parked a block away on a side street, blending my truck into the long shadows of a large oak tree to wait for the legal team. I realized that Officer Walsh wasn't just here to serve papers. He had been fully briefed on the Costa Rica threat, and was prepared to initiate an emergency welfare check on Emma the moment that door opened. I sat in the cab, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles matched the color of the gray sky. Routine can steady the mind, I whispered to my reflection in the rearview mirror. Steady, Callum. Just 10 more minutes. At 8:55 a.m., Evelyn Chambers's silver sedan pulled up behind me, followed immediately by Officer Walsh in his marked cruiser. The sight of the police lights, even unlit, made the reality of the situation settle in my gut like lead. We didn't speak as we stepped onto the pavement. We exchanged a single grim nod. I looked through the front window of the rental from my vantage point and saw Alara pacing the living room in that blue cardigan I'd given her. Alistair was there too, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror, looking every bit the confident businessman. They thought they were heading to a courthouse to finalize a theft that would secure their future. They had no idea the courthouse was currently standing on their sidewalk. Have you ever stood on the precipice of a disaster and realized you were the one who engineered the crash? It's a terrifying kind of peace, knowing that the structural failure is finally out of your hands and into the laws. Before I uncover the truth behind those signatures, let me ask you something. Comment A if Alara deserves another chance, or B if she should face the same fallout as Alistair, and share your reason. Please remember, some upcoming details are dramatized for storytelling. We walked toward the front door as a unit. Evelyn and Officer Walsh led the way while I stayed 10 steps behind my hand, resting on the heavy weight of the tablet in my jacket pocket. The morning air was damp, smelling of wet pavement and dormant earth. As we reached the steps, I noticed an unfamiliar black SUV parked 2 houses down, with its engine idling. The loan sharks were already watching, waiting for Alistair to deliver the deed. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She reached out and pressed the doorbell, the mechanical chime echoing through the thin walls of the rental house. Ding-dong. The sound of a life being served. I heard footsteps approaching from the other side, the sound of the old world ending and the truth finally stepping into the light. The lock clicked, the handle turned, and the door swung open to reveal my daughter's face, a face that was about to lose its last shred of certainty. Alara blinked her eyes, darting from Evelyn's sharp leather briefcase to the silver badge gleaming on Officer Walsh's chest, the color draining from her lips, as if I'd just reached out and physically pulled the life from her. She stood frozen in the doorway, her hands still clutching the blue cardigan I gave her last Christmas, a garment that now looked like a shroud. I stepped forward into her line of sight, and the confusion on her face curdled into a raw, naked fear that made my own stomach twist. Alistair's voice barked from the kitchen, demanding to know who was at the door with that aggressive entitlement he wore like a second skin. He rounded the corner, briefcase in hand, ready to head to the courthouse with the forged documents that would have ended my life as I knew it. But he stopped mid-sentence, his boots skidding slightly on the hardwood as he saw the uniform and the clinical cold focus in my eyes. We arrived at the exact minute the predators were preparing to leave their den. "Then what are you doing here?" "Who are these people?" Alara asked, her voice a thin, structural failure. "We're coming in, Alara," I said, my voice as steady as a concrete pour. "We have things to discuss that can't wait for the courthouse." We filed into the small living room, the space instantly feeling cramped and clinical. The air smelled of wet wool from the morning mist we'd brought in with us. Evelyn Chambers took the lead, her presence commanding and no nonsense, as she cleared a space on the cluttered coffee table, sweeping aside a stack of glossy travel brochures for Costa Rica. Alistair tried to project a blustering confidence, standing with his chest out and his chin tilted up. "This is a private residence. You can't just barge in here," he shouted, his face flushing. Evelyn didn't even look up from her briefcase. "Actually, Mr. Halbrook, we are here to ensure that your private business remains within the boundaries of the law," she replied. Have you ever felt the air in a room turn to liquid? Heavy, impossible to breathe, and tasting of copper. That was the atmosphere in that living room as Alistair's eyes began darting toward the back door, measuring the distance for an escape that Officer Walsh was already blocking with his large, silent frame. The authority in the room had shifted entirely, and Alistair knew it. Snap. The briefcase opened. The trap closed. Evelyn pulled out a thick, structured folder with a crisp, professional finality. She began reciting the formal notice, her voice steady and echoing against the thin walls of the rental. Mrs. Halbrook, you are being formally served notice of revocation of power of attorney and an immediate freeze on all assets pending a fraud investigation. I watched my daughter's hands shake as Officer Walsh extended the heavy legal envelope toward her. It's just paper, Alara, I whispered. Don't look at it like that. But we all knew it was more than paper. It was a concrete block crushing the lies they had built. Evelyn then delivered the final blow, informing Alara that the freeze extended to her personal checking account, the one where she was hiding the $10,000 down payment Alistair had given her to stay quiet. Alara collapsed onto the sofa as the realization set in that her own safety net had been shredded. Alistair stepped forward, his jaw tight, and his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. This is ridiculous. He spat his heavy breathing, the only sound in the room. What exactly are you talking about? I didn't answer Alistair with words. Instead, I reached into my jacket and pulled out the tablet, the screen glowing like a digital executioner's blade in the dim light of their living room. Alistair's jaw tightened, his eyes darting between me and the folder Evelyn had just produced. He was still trying to find the oxygen in the room, his chest heaving as he prepared another volley of aggressive bluster. You can't prove a damn thing, Callum, he spat, his voice cracking with the strain of his own lies. I remained seated on their cheap rented armchair, watching him pace and shout about rights and harassment. He is a structural defect in my family that I am finally ready to collapse. I wait for his volume to peak. For the moment, his desperation turns into a scream before I simply tap the screen of my tablet. I don't need to prove it, Alistair, I said, my voice cutting through his noise with clinical precision. I just need to play it. The sound of his own voice, hushed and intimate, suddenly filled the room, cutting through his shouting like a knife through paper. Audio clip number 1 began to play through the tablet's high-gain speakers, Alistair's midnight call to the mistress from my own kitchen. The room went deathly still as his voice described Alara as useful weight and the old man's signature machine. He explicitly detailed the plan to flee to Costa Rica the moment the deed transfer cleared, leaving my daughter behind to face the legal fallout of a felony forgery case. Have you ever heard the sound of a person's heart actually breaking? It's not a loud crack. It's the sound of a long, slow exhale that never quite ends. Alara's face drained of all color. Her eyes fixed on Alistair as if she were seeing a monster for the first time. The recording even included Alistair mentioning the exact flight number and the September 30th date for his departure, proving he had already purchased the tickets using a secret credit card he'd skimmed from Alara's own emergency savings account. Pack your bags for Costa Rica, the recorded Alistair said with a dry chuckle. Just you and me. Useful weight. That's what he called the mother of his child. The recording ended, but the echoes of Alistair's tinny recorded laughter lingered in the air like a foul odor. Alara was trembling so violently that the legal papers in her hand crinkled like dry leaves in a storm. Alistair tried to step toward her, his hands out in a pleading gesture that looked entirely manufactured, a practiced performance of a man who had run out of real emotions. Alara, honey, that's out of context. He's twisting things, he shouted, but his eyes were wide with a cornered animal's desperation. Alara recoiled, as if he were made of fire, the taste of salt from a single tear. She didn't even know she was crying, hitting her lip. What? What is that, Alistair? She whispered, her voice a hollow wreck. Who were you talking to? As Alistair attempted to lie his way out, Evelyn interjected with a cold, professional, sharp edge. We've already identified the woman on the phone, she said. She's a paralegal from a rival engineering firm. It seems industrial sabotage was the original motive, Mr. Halbrook. Alistair stepped toward me, his face flushing a dangerous shade of red. That's out of context, he started, but I held up a hand. There is more, Alistair. A lot more. The second audio file was labeled with a timestamp that made my blood run cold, 10:15 a.m., the exact minute my granddaughter usually steps onto the playground for recess. I held the tablet steady, the blue-white glare illuminating the absolute moral horror in the room. I pressed play, and the space was instantly filled with Alistair's cold, transactional voice describing the layout of Hawthorne Elementary to a debt collector. He detailed the specific fence line where Emma plays and her 10:15 a.m. recess schedule, offering her vulnerability as a guarantee for his underground gambling debts. The clinical way he sold out his own daughter's safety was a level of depravity that left even Evelyn Chambers looking visibly shaken. But then the recording took a darker turn. Alistair admitted to accepting a protection fee from these criminals to allow them to photograph Emma on the playground for intimidation purposes. My hands didn't shake, but a cold, hard rage settled behind my eyes. How do you breathe when you find out the man sharing your bed has put a price tag on your child's life? Ilara's entire body went rigid as she listened to the description of the playground fence where she had waved goodbye to Emma just yesterday. She dropped the legal papers, the dry sheets of bond paper scattering across the rug like autumn leaves. Her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a sob that sounded like a physical breakage of her soul. She looked at Alistair not with love or even the anger of a betrayed wife, but with the hollow stare of someone looking at a monster. "You used her." She whispered the words barely escaping her throat. "You used our baby to pay for your games." Alistair's face was a mask of sweat and cheap cologne as he tried to backpedal. "I was trying to keep them away from the house, Ilara. I was buying us time." The logic of a coward only served to deepen the silence following his confession. One lunge, one badge, one total collapse of a monster's ego. Alistair finally snapped his bluster, turning into a wild, cornered animal aggression as he lunged toward the tablet in my hand, screaming that I had no right to record his private business. Officer Walsh moved with practiced speed, his leather belt creaking as he intercepted the charge. He blocked Alistair's path and pinned his arm behind his back against the drywall with a force that made the house shudder. Alistair let out a sharp gasp, his cheek pressed into the paint. Because Alistair had explicitly threatened a minor in the recording, Evelyn signaled to Walsh, who transitioned from a civil server to a law enforcement officer performing a protective detention. I stood up, looking down at the man who thought he could steal my house and sell my granddaughter's life. The engineer in me saw the final collapse of the structure. The demolition was complete. Walsh's forearm was a steel bar holding Alistair in place, the sharp scent of adrenaline thick in the air. I looked at Alistair, his face contorted in a mix of pain and fury, and then I turned to my daughter. "It's over, Alistair," I said, my voice as heavy as a burial stone. "But Ilara, for you, it's just beginning. You have a choice to make, and you have exactly 1 minute to make it." The room was silent, the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm has finally broken the windows, leaving nothing but the cold, whistling truth to fill the gaps. I turned my back on Alistair, who was still struggling weakly against Officer Walsh's immovable grip, and focused entirely on Ilara. She was a wreck of a woman trembling on the floor, the smell of fear and stale air in the cramped rental house nearly overpowering. I laid out the 2 paths available to her with the clinical precision of a final inspection report. "You have one choice, Ilara. 1. You stand with him and lose Emma to the state as an accomplice to a felony, or you stand with me and save her." I watched the last of her defensive walls crumble, replaced by the raw, desperate instinct of a mother who finally realized she'd been sleeping next to a predator. I didn't know she sobbed, her voice muffled by her hands. "Dad, I swear I didn't know he'd go after her school." I revealed that the loan sharks Alistair feared had actually been monitored by the FBI for months. His recorded confession wasn't just evidence of a theft. It was the final piece needed for a federal racketeering indictment. Have you ever seen a man realize he's been digging his own grave for 6 months? The look in Alistair's eyes was the only payment I ever needed. I pulled a second set of documents from my jacket, the ones I prepared after my call on Friday. I informed Alistair that the FBI was already very interested in his investors and that his recorded ledger was currently being transcribed by a federal task force. Alistair's face went from a flush of rage to a ghostly, translucent pale. "You called the feds?" He croaked, his voice cracking like dry timber. "You'll ruin everything." I didn't blink. I wasn't just a father protecting a home anymore. I was a man containing a toxic spill. I watched him realize that this wasn't just a lawsuit or a family squabble, it was a prison sentence. The magnitude of his strategic failure settled in his eyes, and the bluster finally bled out of him, leaving behind nothing but the hollow shell of a man who had tried to gamble with lives that weren't his to lose. Game over. The house always wins, Alistair, especially when the house is mine. Evelyn Chambers stepped forward with a crisp authority to finalize the legal handoff. She informed Alistair that because of the specific nature of the recording and the threat to a minor, his passport was already flagged and a temporary restraining order was in effect. Alistair finally stopped fighting Walsh, his body going limp as if his bones had turned to liquid. In a moment of absolute desperation, he tried to bargain, accidentally revealing that the notarized backup folder was hidden under the spare tire in his car. Walsh nodded to a colleague outside, and I knew the physical evidence was as good as secured. I looked at my daughter, who was now sobbing quietly on the rug, and felt no joy, only a somber, exhausted relief. I turned toward the door, the heavy weight of the last 2 weeks finally lifting from my shoulders as I felt the tactile threshold under my boots. As I reached the door, Alistair's voice cracked one last time, high and thin, with the sound of a man drowning in his own choices. "This is entrapment." I didn't look back. The walk to my truck was the longest 50 feet of my life, each step on the damp pavement, sounding like a heavy, final, rhythmic thud that signaled the death of the family I thought I knew. I stood on the porch for a fraction of a second, the cool September air biting through my shirt. Alistair's desperate cry of entrapment was still ringing in my ears, a high, thin sound that carried the jagged edge of a man who realized the walls were finally closing in. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes on the horizon, where the gray Oregon clouds were finally beginning to break, revealing a sliver of cold, uncaring blue. Behind the closed door of the rental, I could hear Alistair's voice rising in a frantic, losing argument with Officer Walsh. Ilara's sobs had transitioned into a low, rhythmic keening that made my chest ache with a phantom weight, the kind of structural pain you feel when you know a foundation is beyond repair. "This isn't over." Callum Alistair screamed, his voice muffled by the wood. "You hear me?" I whispered the answer to the empty air. "It was over the moment you looked at a map of a playground, Alistair." As I reached the sidewalk, I saw the black SUV that had been idling 2 houses down suddenly peel away its tires, chirping against the asphalt. My bluff about the FBI presence had worked better than I'd hoped. The creditors were scatterings like rats from a spotlight. Evelyn Chambers joined me on the sidewalk, her expression as unreadable as a legal brief. She didn't say a word at first, but she placed a firm, supportive hand on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that anchored me to the present. She informed me that Officer Walsh would remain on site until the primary evidence from Alistair's car was secured, and the initial statements were logged. We watched a second patrol car pull up to the curb with a quiet authority. The welfare check on Emma was being initiated at Hawthorne Elementary. For the first time in 2 weeks, the crushing pressure in my lungs eased, and I felt like I could actually draw a full breath of air. "The state will take it from here," Callum Evelyn said, her voice a calm bulkhead against the chaos. "Go home." I looked at her, my eyes stinging. "Is she safe, Evelyn? Is Emma really safe?" She nodded once, a sharp, professional movement. "She is. Have you ever won a war only to realize you're the only one left standing on the battlefield? The silence is heavier than the gunfire ever was." I climbed into the driver's seat of my truck, and pulled the door shut, the heavy thud, sealing out the world of Southeast 82nd Avenue. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, the cold vibration of the idling engine traveling up my arms. I watched the house through the rearview mirror, half expecting it to implode under the weight of the lies I'd exposed. I had saved my assets. I had protected my granddaughter. But the bridge back to my daughter had been burned to the waterline, and the smoke was still thick in the air. Inhale. Exhale. The air tasted like rain and freedom. It was bitter. I pulled my phone from my pocket and found a final text from Warren Phillips. The cloud account is deleted. Your house is yours again. I turned the key and the engine rumbled to life, but as I glanced at the passenger seat, I saw Emma's forgotten coloring book, the one thing I couldn't protect from the truth. I am sorry, Patricia, I whispered to the empty cabin. I did what I had to do. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of gray rain and phone calls that felt like echoes from another life. But it was the vibrating buzz of my phone at 10 a.m. on Thursday that finally broke the static. I was standing in the hallway, the faint smell of damp dust hitting my nose, as I unscrewed a dead light bulb, a mundane task intended to keep my hands from shaking. I answered the call from Evelyn Chambers and held the cold, vibrating device to my ear. She chose Emma Callum, Evelyn said, her voice carrying a weight of professional satisfaction. Ilara called my office an hour ago. She's broken, but she's resolute. She has agreed to cooperate fully with the authorities. Evelyn explained that my daughter was currently signing a cooperation agreement, handing over every shred of evidence regarding Alistair's coercion and his gambling contacts. Most importantly, she had filed for an emergency divorce and a petition for sole custody. She had finally chosen her daughter over her fear. Good, I replied, staring at the empty light socket. Emma needs her mother, the version of her that isn't afraid of a shadow. Evelyn revealed that because of the clear evidence of coercion, the district attorney had decided not to press criminal charges against Ilara, provided her testimony secured the convictions of the ringleaders. 2 weeks later, the Oregon autumn had turned sharp and biting. I was in my workshop when Evelyn called again. FBI, raid, arrest. Those 3 words felt like the closing of a heavy iron door. The system I had trusted to protect my life had finally turned its gears against the man who tried to dismantle it. Evelyn informed me that the federal task force had executed a coordinated strike on the illegal gambling ring Alistair was indebted to. 5 major arrests were made, including his primary creditor, effectively erasing the physical threat to Emma's school. The vulture is caged, Mr. Rowland, she said. Alistair is facing 5 to 7 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. And the school, I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Are those men gone? They're processed and in custody, she assured me. The threat is neutralized. I learned that Alistair had attempted to flee to the airport 2 hours before the raid, but his passport had already been flagged by the FBI contact I provided. He was arrested right there in the security line, clutching a carry-on bag full of stolen hopes. I hung up and walked out to the backyard garden, the air smelling of dormant earth and the coming winter. Have you ever noticed how roses bloom brightest right before the first frost? It's as if they know they have to make the beauty count. Patricia's roses were still blooming, a vibrant red defiance against the encroaching gray. I touched a petal gently, the tactile softness a strange contrast to my own calloused thumb. The structural failure of my family had been shored up by federal steel, and the threat had been eliminated at its very source. I stood in the silence, listening to the autumn wind whistle through the garden beds, realizing that the weight of the coloring book I still kept in my truck was finally starting to feel a little lighter. It's over, Patricia, I whispered to the wind. The fortress held. I touched the last red rose of the season and whispered, it's over. But as I walked back inside, I knew there was one more legal document that needed my signature, one that would change Ilara's life forever. How much is a daughter's loyalty worth once it's been appraised, traded, and found wanting in the cold light of a forged signature. The walk back into my house had felt different with Alistair behind bars, but the structural integrity of my family was still compromised. I arrived at Evelyn's office for a final permanent legal restructuring on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The long orange glow of the autumn sunset spilled through the windows, casting skeletal shadows across the mahogany desk. I sat across from Evelyn Chambers one last time, the smell of mahogany and old leather anchoring me. We weren't here to discuss arrests today. We were here for the final demolition. I want her removed from every schedule of assets, Evelyn. Totally and permanently, I said, my voice steady. It wasn't an act of malice, but a structural necessity. I cannot leave my life's work to someone who proved they could be bent by the first predator to come along. Are you sure, Callum? She asked, her eyes searching mine. This is a bell you can't unring. I nodded without hesitation. I'm an engineer, Evelyn. I know when a beam is too warped to hold weight. A will is just a blueprint for a life that hasn't ended yet. And like any good blueprint, it needs a fail-safe. The second half of the document was the reconstruction. I established an irrevocable spendthrift trust for Emma, ensuring her education, healthcare, and future were shielded from both Alistair's greed and Alara's poor judgment. I appointed a corporate trustee to manage the funds, removing the temptation from Alara entirely. Emma is the future of this family, I explained. She's the only part left that hasn't been compromised. As I reviewed the Emma provision, I realized I was building a bridge for my granddaughter that her mother would never be allowed to cross. However, I included a conditional amnesty clause. Alara would receive a modest monthly stipend, but only if she maintained a permanent restraining order against Alistair and completed a court-ordered financial responsibility program. It was a door I was leaving ajar, though I didn't expect her to walk through it anytime soon. Love means consequences, and I was finally enforcing them. Ink, paper, seal, the family tree was pruned. Evelyn placed the heavy stack of paper in front of me, and the fountain pen felt cold and balanced in my hand. I signed each page with the same steady hand that once drafted thousands of bridge blueprints. With each stroke of black ink, the Hallbrook influence was purged from my legacy. As I signed the final page, Evelyn handed me a small envelope left by Alistair's mistress. It contained a coded key to a digital offshore account Alistair had hidden even from Alara. I didn't even look at the balance. I simply pushed it across the desk toward Evelyn. Give this to the corporate trustee for Emma, I said. Let it be the first stone in her new foundation. When the last document was notched and filed, I felt a strange, hollow peace. The fortress was finished, the perimeter was secure, and the old man was finally truly alone inside it. Thank you, Evelyn, for everything, I whispered. I stood up and felt the tactile weight of the completed trust in my mind. I walked out to the parking lot and looked at the sunset, my shadow stretching out long and thin across the pavement, a solitary figure in a world I had spent my final strength to secure. The first frost of November arrived a week later, turning the garden into a silver graveyard of summer memories. And it was in that brittle silence that my phone chimed with a name I hadn't seen on the screen in 42 days. I was standing at my lathe in the workshop, the mechanical hum and the smell of cedar shavings providing a rhythmic sanctuary that I had come to rely on. I stopped the motor, the silence rushing back into the room like a flood, and looked at the notification lighting up my workbench. It was a simple text from Alara, can we talk, just us. Bluebird Park at 2 o'clock. After everything, the recordings, the FBI raid, and the restated trust that had essentially excised her from my legacy, the brevity of the message felt like a structural tremor in my newly reinforced life. As I navigated the settings to reply, I discovered that she had been trying to call me from a restricted number for weeks. My new security software, the very fortress I had built to keep the predators out, had been silently blocking her, leaving me more isolated than I had ever intended to be. Cedar shavings are like memories. If you don't sweep them up, they get under your skin and start to itch. I stared at the phone for nearly 20 minutes, watching the fine cedar dust settle on the glass screen like a dusting of November snow. Part of me wanted to maintain the perimeter, to stay inside the safety of the locks and the legal bulwarks I had spent so much energy constructing. But then I remembered Emma's coloring book, sitting on the passenger seat of my truck, a quiet reminder of the innocent life caught in the crossfire of our collapse. I realized that while the legal battle was won, the human wreckage still needed to be cleared away before the winter set in. I typed a single word, yes, and felt the internal pressure of a dam that was no longer as solid as I believed. I am not doing this for him, I whispered to the empty rafters. I am doing this for her. One word, yes. The bridge was rebuilt with a single keystroke, however fragile the span might be. I cleaned the workshop with a meticulousness that bordered on the obsessive putting every chisel and gauge back into its specific shadowboard silhouette. I changed into the heavy jacket I had worn to Evelyn's office, checking my pocket to ensure the tablet wasn't there. I won't need weapons today, I told myself. Just the truth. Whatever is left of it. As I walked toward my truck, the biting November air nipped at my lungs, reminding me that some structures can be repaired, while others can only be replaced by something entirely new. I pulled out of the driveway and paused at the curb. Across the street, a white moving van was parked at the rental house. Alistair's mistress was methodically clearing out his belongings, revealing that the parallel life he had built was being dismantled by the very people he had trusted. The demolition was total. I drove toward Bluebird Park with a somber determination, my boots crunching on the frost-covered grass as I approached the duck pond. I saw her sitting on a bench near the frozen water, a silhouette of grief in a heavy coat I didn't recognize. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have a blueprint for what to say next. Bluebird Park was empty, the playground equipment standing like skeletal remains under the gray sky. I walked across the frozen grass, the rhythmic crunch of each step echoing in the silence of the November afternoon. I saw Alara sitting on the bench by the duck pond, her silhouette small and huddled against a cold wind that whipped through her winter coat. I sat down on the opposite end of the frost-slicked bench, the distance between us exactly 4 feet, a physical gap that felt like a canyon neither of us knew how to bridge. She didn't look at me for a long time, her eyes fixed on the frozen water where a few brave ducks huddled near the reeds. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin and fragile like dry glass. I was so afraid of losing the house that I lost everything else instead, she whispered. She admitted she knew Alistair was in financial trouble, but claimed she never knew the extent of the depravity regarding Emma. I listened with the clinical detachment of a lead engineer inspecting a collapsed structure looking for what could be salvaged. She revealed she'd already started working a minimum wage job at a local grocery store to support Emma. It was the first sign of responsibility I'd seen in years. "Do you still hate me, Dad?" She asked, her gaze finally flickering toward mine. 0%. That was her rating. My own daughter. I didn't answer her question directly. Instead, I laid out the conditions of our future relationship with the precision of a contract. I told her about the irrevocable trust I'd established for Emma and the conditional stipend for her own survival. I made it clear that while I would remain a grandfather, my role as her father had changed from provider to overseer. Emma's future is sealed. I said, the cold air biting at my lungs. Yours is up to you. There will be no more joint accounts, no more power of attorney, and no more secrets. If that trust is broken again, the bridge is gone for good. Trust isn't a gift, Alara. It's a structure. And right now, yours has a 0% safety rating. She nodded slowly, accepting the terms with a resignation that suggested she had expected far worse. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the ghosts of the family we used to be, before greed and a predator named Alistair had dismantled the foundation. Can a bridge ever be truly safe again after it's been sabotaged from the inside? Or do you just spend the rest of your life waiting for the next crack I watched Alara stand up, her movement slow and stiff from the cold. "Thank you for the stipend," she said, her eyes red-rimmed. "I'll start the financial responsibility program on Monday." I didn't offer her a hug. I didn't offer her a way back into my house. I stayed seated, a solitary figure in a coat that felt too heavy. "Goodbye, Alara." "Drive safe," I replied. I watched her walk toward her car, her small frame disappearing into the gathering mist of the Oregon afternoon. The fortress I had built was now the only thing I had left to inhabit. As she pulled away, I realized she had left a small, cream-colored envelope on the bench. It wasn't a request for money or a plea for forgiveness. I opened it to find a handwritten letter from Emma, the only person whose trust remained untarnished by the wreckage. I watched her car disappear into the mist, and as I reached for Emma's envelope, I saw my own reflection in the frozen pond, a man who had protected his wealth, but stood entirely alone in the frost. The workshop was warmer than the park, but it felt just as empty. I didn't open Emma's letter until I was back in the sanctuary of my workbench, the smell of cedar shavings rising to meet me like an old friend who didn't care about my mistakes. I sat on my stool and carefully unfolded the paper. Emma's childish handwriting revealed a truth I hadn't expected. She knew Daddy was going away because she had seen him packing his suitcase weeks before the confrontation. It was a sobering reminder that children see the cracks in a structure long before the adults are willing to admit the building is falling. I set the letter aside, my heart heavy with the realization that my granddaughter had been living in the shadow of a collapse for far longer than I had. The first month of our new reality passed with a clinical quiet consistency. Every Sunday, Alara brings Emma to the house for a 4-hour supervised visit. She stays in the kitchen, punctual and quiet, serving a sentence in the quietest prison imaginable. I brought her favorite snacks, Dad, she told me last Sunday, her voice low. "They're on the counter." I only nodded. "Thank you, Alara. We'll be in the shop if you need us." Trust is like a finish on fine mahogany. Once you strip it away, you can never quite get the same luster back, but the wood underneath is still solid. In the workshop, I finally began the lessons I promised. Emma stands on a sturdy step stool I built specifically for her, her small hands guided by mine as we sand a block of pine for a birdhouse. The sound of the handplane smoothing a board provided a rhythmic background to our work. I find myself explaining the mechanics of stress and support not just in wood, but in the world. I am teaching her that some things are built to last, while others are built to be replaced, and that the quality of the material matters more than the finish. "Is it strong now, Grandpa?" She asked, her eyes bright with a curiosity that Alistair hadn't managed to extinguish. "It's getting there, Emma," I replied, guiding her hand across the grain. "You have to find the grain first." I took a sip of hot, bitter coffee, the warmth a welcome relief against the cold draft near the door. Click. The screen went black. I was no longer a spy, I was just a grandfather. On a Tuesday night, as the first real snow began to dust the Oregon pines, I sat at my workbench and opened the surveillance software one last time. I watched the empty rental house across the street, now bearing a for lease sign in the yard. Then I toggled the feed to Alara's new apartment. She was sitting with Emma, helping her with homework, the scene mundane and safe. As I prepared to log off, I noticed a notification from my bank. Alara had been putting half of her modest monthly stipend into a savings account for me, a quiet, unforced attempt to pay back the theft. I realized then that a fortress is only a prison if you never let yourself leave. With a single deliberate click, I deleted the remote access software forever. "The perimeter is secure," I whispered to the empty shop. "Good night, Emma. Good night, Alara." I walked to the workshop door and flipped the switch, leaving the tools in the dark. As I stepped out into the biting November air, I saw my own footprints in the fresh snow leading away from the fortress and toward the house. The garden outside was a skeleton of its former self, buried under a foot of Oregon snow. but inside the workshop. The air was warm and thick with the scent of cherry wood and the quiet concentration of a child. I watched my own footprints in the fresh snow leading back toward the house from the night before. A trail of resolve that felt permanent now. Emma and I were working on a small jewelry box, a replica of the one I had made for Patricia 30 years ago. I watched her small hands follow the grain of the cherry wood, her brow furrowed in that same engineering focus I used to see in my own reflection. As we worked, I noticed a small notebook tucked into her pocket. She pulled it out to show me sketches of the garden and the lathe detailed drawings that mirrored my own analytical worldview. "Will the roses remember to come back, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice light against the howling wind outside. "The roots are deep, Emma," I replied, placing my calloused hand over hers. "They never forget where they belong. I am teaching her that sleep isn't death. It's just a structural pause, and that some things have to be sanded down to their rawest form before they can truly shine. Fine grit, no more rough edges." The healing had finally begun. We moved from the coarse sandpaper to the fine grit, the wood becoming smooth as silk under Emma's palm. She grew quiet for a moment, the only sound the rhythmic rasp of the paper against the cherry. "Mommy said she's learning how to fix things," she said, looking up at me. "Like you, Grandpa, I felt the last of my anger toward Alara turning into a manageable, distant weight, much like the sawdust we were currently brushing away." "Exactly like me, sweetheart," I told her. "We're all just trying to keep the house standing." I didn't tell her about the court dates or the stipend I'd arranged. I only wanted her to know that everyone sometimes makes a mistake in their blueprints. The quality of the material is what matters. And despite the fractures Alistair had caused, the wood of this family was still salvageable if we worked slowly enough. I felt a sense of forgiveness taking root, a quiet reconstruction of the bridge I thought I had burned to the waterline. Wood oil is like time. It doesn't change the nature of the thing, it just makes the truth of it easier to see. We applied the first coat of oil together, watching the cherry wood deepen into a rich, protective amber. Emma's eyes lit up as the grain revealed itself, a hidden pattern that had been there all along, just waiting for the right touch. "It's beautiful, Grandpa," she whispered. "It looks like it's glowing." "That is because it is strong on the inside, Emma," I said. "That is what matters." I realized then that my survival wasn't about the money or the deed. It was about being the one person left to show her the pattern. As we finished, I turned the box over and showed her the small letter C I had carved into the bottom. A Roland legacy reclaimed from the Halbrook influence forever. I looked at the empty spot on the wall where the hidden camera used to be, then back at my granddaughter, and I finally understood that the best way to watch over someone isn't with a lens, but with a steady hand. I felt a sense of completion that no structural report could ever provide. The snow stopped falling just as Alara's car pulled into the driveway. The snow stopped falling just as Alara's car pulled into the driveway. The silence that followed, not the heavy, suffocating kind I'd lived with for months, but something lighter, like a building that had finally settled into its new foundation. I stood on the porch, my breath blooming in the cold air, as Alara secured Emma into her car seat. We didn't exchange words of forgiveness. We simply exchanged a look of mutual recognition of the new hard boundaries that define our lives. "See you next Sunday, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Next Sunday, Alara." "Drive safe," I replied. She drove away, and I was left with the quiet dominance of a man who fought a war in the shadows and won back the right to live in the light. The fortress was no longer a bunker. It was just a home again. I watched the taillights fade, knowing the perimeter I'd built didn't just protect my money, but the fragile chance for my daughter to become the mother Emma deserves. I returned to the workshop, the smell of cold cedar and wood oil greeting me. I opened my laptop for the final time in this professional capacity. I found the encrypted chat with Warren Phillips, the man who had given me the eyes to see through Alistair's lies. I tried to process the final payment, but I realized Warren had already refused it. He'd left a short note seeing a master engineer at work was payment enough. I felt a surge of mutual respect for the man across the street who had risked his own peace for mine. "The job is done, Warren. Wipe the drive," I typed. "Operation complete," Callum came the immediate reply. "Take care of that granddaughter. Delete. Erase. Gone." The digital ghosts were finally laid to rest. It was the final engineering check on a bridge I never wanted to build, but one that saved my family from a total structural collapse. What is the weight of a secret once it's been told it's nothing? It's lighter than the air in an empty workshop. As I initiated the final wipe of the laptop, I discovered one last hidden file Warren had left for me. I clicked it, and suddenly the workshop was filled with the sound of Patricia's voice. It was a recording from a years-old backed-up security test we'd forgotten about. "Callum, honey, don't forget to come in for dinner," she said, her voice warm and full of the life we'd shared. It was an audible blessing from the woman who had started the garden, a final reassurance that the foundation we'd laid together was still holding firm. I closed the laptop, the lid clicking shut, with a sound of absolute finality. I listened to the house. It was quiet, but it was a living silence, the hum of the refrigerator, the wind in the pines, the absence of Alistair's predatory pacing. I looked at the jewelry box. Emma and I had finished the oil, giving the cherry wood a soft, protective glow. I am an old man with a steady hand, and for the first time in a very long time, I don't feel the need to watch anything at all. No more cameras. Rest easy, Patricia. The house is safe. I stood in the center of the room and breathed in the scent of cedar one last time before flipping the light switch, finally content to let the shadows be just shadows. The gravel crunched under my boots as I crossed the yard, a solitary sound, in a neighborhood that had finally stopped feeling like a battlefield. I had stepped out of the workshop and flipped the switch, leaving the tools in the dark. And as I walked toward the house, I saw my own footprints in the fresh snow, leading away from the fortress I'd inhabited for so long. I didn't reach for my phone to check the perimeter. I didn't even feel the phantom vibration that had haunted my thigh for months. I realized then that my psychological recovery had finally caught up to my legal victory. I stood on the back porch and looked at the heavy brass master key in my hand, the one that opens every door in a house I almost lost. I thought about the months spent behind monitors, the cold calculations, and the weight of the tablet that used to live in my pocket. Now there are no cameras hidden in the eaves and no software monitoring the digital air. The greatest engineering feat of my life wasn't building the fortress, but knowing when it was finally safe enough to take the walls down. "A home isn't a structure you defend," I whispered to the cold Oregon night. "It's a place where you finally stop looking over your shoulder." I turned and looked out at the snow-covered garden, where Patricia's roses sleep beneath the frost safe and undisturbed. The orange glow of the sunset hit the white drifts, turning the backyard into a sea of fire and ice. The cycle of seasons is the ultimate blueprint, a reminder that even the deepest winter is just a preparation for a new spring. I am an old man, and my hands are tired, but as I look at the house, I know that Emma's future is as secure as the roots of those roses. I've done my job. The foundation is deep, the materials are honest, and the house stands firm. The roots are deep enough now, I thought, feeling a triumphant peace. Sleep well, Patricia. I finished the work. A curtain is more than fabric. It's the final boundary of a man's soul. It is the line between the public war and the private peace. I stood there for a long minute, letting the cold bite into my lungs one last time. A reminder that I was still here, still standing, and still the master of my own domain. Click. The lock turned. The story ended. I opened the back door and stepped into the sudden welcoming warmth of the kitchen, the smell of wood oil and my old jacket clinging to me. I set the master key on the anniversary bowl, the ceramic clink, sounding like a gavel bringing a long trial to order. I looked out the window one last time at the fading light over the pines. There are no more secrets, no more recordings, and no more shadows to chase. Before I walked away from the glass, I thought of the small digital drive I'd tucked into the back of the jewelry box Emma and I finished. It contains a video message for her to open on her 18th birthday, explaining why her grandfather did what he did, ensuring the truth survives long after my own heartbeat fades. "Good night, world," I murmured. "I'm home." I pulled the curtain shut, the darkness of the yard disappearing as the warm light of the kitchen took hold. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to look back. The structure was sound. The project was complete. Looking back now, I realize my greatest mistake in this family story wasn't trusting my daughter. It was ignoring the quiet warning signs when the first cracks appeared. I convinced myself that silence would keep the peace, but silence only allowed the damage to spread deeper. If there is one lesson hidden inside this family story, it is this: the truth may hurt, but ignoring it will cost far more in the end. What happened here is more than revenge or justice. It is one of those difficult grandpa stories about protecting the next generation when the people you trusted lose their way. I learned that trust is like the foundation of a house. Once it's sabotaged from within, the entire structure begins to collapse. The strongest defenses are not built with locks or walls, but with honesty, accountability, and the courage to act when something feels wrong. This experience also reminded me that every grandpa stories moment carries responsibility. Being a grandfather doesn't just mean telling bedtime tales or building birdhouses in the workshop. Sometimes it means standing up when the storm arrives, protecting a child's future, even when it breaks your own heart. I believe the Lord places strength in us exactly when we need it most, even if we don't recognize it until the battle is already underway. In the end, this family story taught me that protecting the people you love isn't always gentle. Sometimes love requires hard boundaries and consequences that no one wants to face. Integrity becomes the master key, the one thing that keeps the door between right and wrong from ever being locked. And if there is one truth every grandpa story's lesson should leave behind, it is this: children deserve a future built on safety, honesty, and courage. Even when the cost is high, those things are always worth defending. Thank you for walking through this family story with me until the very end. I would truly like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if your own family betrayed your trust like this? Share your perspective in the comments. And if this story moved, you consider subscribing so you won't miss more stories like this in the future. One final note. While this narrative draws inspiration from real-world themes of family conflict and financial betrayal, certain details have been dramatized to enhance the storytelling experience.